we've still got there's time after the conference as well to grab leaflets and so on and sign up for membership with the MCC. There could be. I'll ask that very question in a moment. To be honest, I don't know, but I'm sure there could be. I can't see anyone.
Yeah, the drift.
Any more? Are we all in? Roughly? Right. Right, okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I know we've not had time to really sit still, flying by our seat of our pants to one session to the next, which is good. You have to reflect on the way home, all those journeys home. Some of us will have long journeys, so make sure we find some time to reflection and catch up on what the learning points are. We'll do a little bit of that at the end. So thanks for sticking with us, and thanks to our speakers so far. We now have Dr. Carol Pembleton, who is our keynote speaker, and we are going to hear from her all about resilience and the importance of resilience to leaders and in coping with change, ambiguity, transformation, the importance to ourselves as well with resilience. And you just tested us a little bit on that by not coming back as quickly as we'd like, so we've had to practice a bit of resilience ourselves here. But anyway, I'm not going to witter on because we're running short on time, so thank you, Carol, for coming, and we look forward to learning an awful lot. I know we will from your sessions.
Thank you. Oh, I'm mic'd. This session's being recorded.
I forgot to say that, yes.
So if when we come to question time, we're going to pass microphones around so that it'll be, people will be able to hear what you're asking. What I didn't know when I arrived here this morning is that the day was going to start with a woman from Liverpool, Stephanie, and it was going to end with a woman from Liverpool, me. So we're linked. And if I'm nervous, I'll sound like Cilla Black, because that always comes out, my inner Cilla Black when I'm nervous. I'm really pleased to be here because I started my career actually in local government. My first proper job was as a careers officer in a local authority. And actually my first learning about resilience came through one of my clients because I was responsible for school leavers with disabilities in that part of the world. And one of my earliest clients was an 18-year-old young man who was blind, who returned to the area from his boarding school. And he came to see me and he told me that he wanted to be a recording engineer. And everybody had told him it was just not possible that somebody who had as limited sight as he had. But he was absolutely convinced, and he'd worked out how to operate a small recording deck, a sound deck. And he said, if I could go up to this, I think it was 16 track or something at those times, then I think that I could work in a recording studio. And he was so committed that I sort of got infected by his sort of desire. And so I researched, this was before computers, but I researched and found that there were literally hundreds of little recording studios around the country at that time. And so I made a list of them, and every week I would type 10 letters, and this was before laptops or any of that, so I'd be on my electric typewriter with my Tipp-Ex, and I would send off 10 letters, and every week I'd either get back rejections or no reply. And every week he'd ring me and say, have you heard anything? And I'd say, I'd try and say something vague, and he'd say, well, you've just got to keep on trying. And so I'd do another 10 lessons, another. And eventually, a very small recording studio that was just 2 guys said, yeah, we'll take him on. We'll take him on and give him 6 months training. And he went off. And the last I heard of him, he was working as a sound engineer with a TV company, which was, it's a great story. But what it taught me was, it taught me 2 things. One is that the best predictor of career success is the motivation of the individual. And the other was that how people become amazingly resilient when they have got a clear purpose and determination. And you'll see links in what I'm going to say with some of the messages that Stephanie's been giving you throughout the day. So he was my sort of first exposure to resilience. And then, in fact, my interest in later life, when I've become an executive coach, my interest in resilience again came out of a client who I'd worked with who'd been very successful. He was successful. And I realized, because I'd coached him over a number of years, that his behavior was changing. And I couldn't quite figure out what was different about this guy. And eventually, he became ill. And I was really, as you do as coaches, you ask yourself, why didn't I notice that? Why did I not see that this was happening? And when he came back to work, we started talking about what had happened to him, and this idea of resilience and loss of resilience and what causes loss of resilience became part of our coaching. And it was that actually started me in wanting to research how do we help people regain resilience as coaches when they've lost access to their own resources. So that's where I started from. And what I want to share with you in this session is I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, what is resilience? I mean, the word gets used everywhere, right? I see it all over the place. Football managers are always talking about their teams as being resilient, which means they scored a 90-minute goal usually. There's actually a hair product that promises you hair resilience. There you go. You hear it everywhere, at least I do, because I'm now tuned in. So men, looking for some hair resilience. I'm going to give you some time to think about your own resilience. I want to position it in terms of, well, what different coaching needs come out of thinking about resilience with our clients. And then hopefully you're going to have something that you can take away and try out, which has been one of the themes, I think, of the whole day. So that's where we're heading. But I want to sort of look at resilience just through these 4 images, because I think they say to me a lot about what resilience is in humans. So this is a tree, as you can see. It's in Japan. And do you remember the tsunami a number of years ago, and then the earthquake that followed from that? Well, the reason this guy's taking a picture of his mate is because this was the only tree that survived in that area. And so it's become a sort of tourist spot. Come and have your picture taken. And the reason it survived, of course, is because it's tall and spindly. And so it could bend. It could bend and adapt and flex, and it didn't break. Whereas trees, which were much sort of rooted and more rigid, actually were blown over. So I think the first aspect of resilience for me is that it's about that ability to bend with the pressures without being broken by them. The second image is Aleppo. This is Aleppo, and as we know, it's undergone the most terrible bombings, which have tested the resilience of those who work there, live there. But the reason I put up this image is to just look at these guys. The buildings may be destroyed, but they're still carrying on. They just put up the tarpaulin and find another way of earning their living. And so that speaks to me about resilience being about creativity. If you can't do it this way, how else can you do it? And they're determined they're going to carry on regardless of whatever else is going on around them. And then the third image comes from, obviously, the Paris terrorist attacks. And that candle saying, you will not kill, you will not take away our liberty, which speaks to me of the determination, that grit, that when people have got grit, when they've got determination, how powerful that is at helping them to keep going through tough times. And then the last image I want to show you is this, which is something called the tap-tap code. And the tap-tap code was a code that was developed during the Vietnam War by a US soldier who was captured, and he and his colleagues were imprisoned in what was called a Hanoi Hilton. And so they were kept in conditions where they were not allowed any contact with each other. And so they were isolated in their cells. And one day he realized that he literally had a piece of toilet paper and he had something he could write on. And he developed this code, which is a 5x5 code, the letters of the alphabet, with the letter Q also standing for the letter K. And what he did one day is he crumpled up the piece of paper, and they were allowed to pass each other as they were going to the toilet. So he passed the piece of paper to the guy he was going to, and that guy learnt the code. And then he passed it on, and he passed it on. And what it meant was that if one of them was, say, taken away for interrogation, when they came back, somebody would tap to you through the wall. So if they just wanted to check, are you okay? They would tap. In this case, they would do 3 taps, 1, 2, 3, to the 3rd column, and they'd leave a space, and then they'd tap 1, 2, 3, 4, which would take them to the O. And then they'd leave a gap, and then they'd do 1, 2, 3, 4, which would get them to the 4th column, space 1, and that would get them okay. And then the person would reply. And this code was taught to everybody who came in the unit. And what it meant was that everybody always knew that there was somebody there to support them. And when they came out of captivity, one of the things they talked about was the importance of this code. Because in a situation in which, they had so little, they talked about how important knowing that there was somebody, even though you couldn't talk to them, in the next cell who was there for them. And also that they had to keep going because they had to be able to support the person in the cell on the other side. And so that aspect of resilience as being the ability to both ask for support and give support, I think is also another really important aspect of how we can help people to stay in that resourced place. So there's resilience in 4 images. There are many definitions of resilience. If you look to the sciences, they'll talk about it as the ability of a material to sort of absorb a shock and return to its natural state. You'll hear about it in terms of it's the ability of a plant to survive in really difficult circumstances and to find a way through. All those weeds that find their way through the concrete, regardless of how you try and stop them. But the definition I came up with is this one, which you can read there, which is about how do we help people and how do we stay flexible in how we're thinking and how we're behaving and in our emotions when either we are being stretched by the sort of many demands of the workplace, or the person is going through a major disruption. Because I think resilience gets knocked both on a day-by-day, drip-by-drip basis, but also sometimes it's taken away because something horrible happens. The deaths, the divorces, the illness, the job loss, those big life shocks. And for me, the importance of working with people on resilience issues isn't that we get them to bounce back. That phrase that often gets used, resilience is about bounce back. Well, actually, I don't think bounce back is enough when we're working with people. I had a client this year who's had a horrible, horrible year. She was removed from her job. She had the most terrible appraisal ratings. She had major surgery. It went wrong. She was off for months. And she said to me, at the end of this, I haven't gone through all of this to bounce back. Something's got to come out of this, otherwise it hasn't been worth going through. And that's why when I talk about resilience with my clients, I don't talk about bounce back. I talk about it in 2 ways. I talk about it in terms of, we'll use that, of slinky. Do you remember the slinky that you had as kids? Right, and you put it on the stair, and it went down. Yeah. And I think when people get stressed, which is what happens, work stretches people. The purpose of them having coaching with us is that they can use that stretch to get some momentum to move forward, not just to get back to the same point. And so for me, resilience is more like a slinky than it is a bouncing ball. But I also know that many of the people that you work with and I work with are under enormous strain. And that strain comes from this stuff. You know, does that phrase get used a lot in your environments? Yeah, everyone says VUCA. Oh, it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. But that phrase actually came from the American War College. There was a phrase that came from looking at the nature of modern warfare, and now it's become, this is how we expect organizations to be. So the people we work with are working with all of that, and they're working with that, whether that's money, whether it's people, whether it's space, whether it's time. And I think the result of that is that many of our clients are like Stretch Armstrong, right? They are stretched. And when you stretch, inevitably you become more rigid. There's a point at which your elasticity goes, and you can't be creative, and you can't be flexible. And that's where they need our help to help them to get back to that resourced and more flexible place. And another client of mine uses this analogy. Do any of you remember Weebles? Yeah, yeah. If you're of a certain generation, you'll know this. And what was the strapline of Weebles? Yes, some blank faces. Some people obviously watch better TV. Right. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. Right, can you see that? Yeah? And my client said to me, you know, I'm like a Weeble. I'm constantly wobbling, and I never quite fall down. And I think that's how lots of managers feel, that they never get back to that stable place because they're constantly being knocked. And so they're either knocked or they're stretched. So I think our clients are under a lot of resilient strain. And our role is to help them to find ways of staying flexible and resourced. So that's how I understand resilience. And that's how I talk about it with my clients. But what is resilience? Where does it come from? So there's three ways in which we get resilience. There's some genetics, there's some stuff that we get in childhood, and there's some stuff that we get through dealing with life. So I'm going to talk about all three and then give you a chance to think about your own. So this was the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, and they have come to the conclusion that resilience is like a seesaw. And at the fulcrum of the seesaw is our genes, what our genes have given us. And then there are either negative or positive influences, particularly in childhood, which shape the amount of resilience that we have available to us. And so in terms of our genetics, there is a variation of a gene, which means you will either have more or less serotonin available to you. So some people have the genetic advantage that they have more easy access to serotonin. So if you're a happy baby, was anyone in this room a happy baby? Oh, we've got one, right? Two. So they may have the gift of being more serotoninally fueled than maybe the rest of us, which is a great advantage because, you know, those people, you know, you come across people who just seem to be able to float. You think, how do they deal with that? They just roll with it. Maybe they've got a serotonin advantage. Or, you know, we hear so much about neuroplasticity, but actually some recent work shows that some people are actually more neurally plastic. It's easier for them to rewire than it is for others. So you expose people to the same stressors, and one will adjust much more quickly than the other. It may be they've got some neural advantage. And on the other side, there is a variation of the gene that produces adrenaline, which means that some people produce it much more easily, and it spikes higher, and it takes longer to come down. So they've got a disadvantage. They may respond much more rapidly to stressors than perhaps some other people would. And equally, there's another variation around the amygdala about how quickly, the speed at which the amygdala responds. which again may mean that some people attach much more emotional meaning to it, to stimuli, than perhaps another person does. So there is some genetics in here, but it's not the most important bit. And even, I saw some work the other week that said, even if you had every genetic advantage available to you, it would only account for 50% of your resilience. And conversely, if you had 50%, on the other side, it was disadvantage, it would still only account for 50%. So there's genes. Then there's the stuff that happens to us in childhood. So on the negative side, any of these could mean that somebody is less prepared to deal with the knocks of life because of what they experienced in their early years. And on the other side, of course, children who have any of these advantages, particularly around attachment, so that children who have very secure early years where they've got a strong sense of attachment to a key adult or adults, are actually much more prepared for resilience because they've got a sense of a safe base from which you can go out and take risk and deal with it. So there's certainly something around that. But of course, we all know people who've had some of these disadvantages, but are very resilient because they had some of the other advantages as well. So it plays out obviously differently for different people. So there's something about what protection as our childhood experience has given us. And there's a very important study, probably the most important study that was ever done on resilience, was done with a community of 687 children in Hawaii who were followed for 30 years. Now, those 687 kids were living with all of the negative influences. They were living in poverty. They often had inadequate parenting. There were mental health issues. There were abuse issues. So the researchers were interested in what are their life chances? What might you expect? And of course, what they found after 30 years was that 2/3 of them were pretty much following parental patterns, but 1/3 of them weren't. And so those were the third they focused on. What explained that those thirds did better? And the conclusions they came to was that the kids who did better were children who created a sense of purpose for themselves early on in their lives. They were kids who said, I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a rock star. I'm going to be a footballer. That they made an active decision that they wanted their lives to be different. And I certainly see that. It's really interesting for me being in this room, because the last time I was in this room was actually with a group of leaders from UNICEF who were here doing